wanted me to spend a little bit of time talking about hay losses and where we stand right now with hay production. And I'm going to start off with just kind of an overview of where we are with hay right now. As you know, the entire southeast right now is having quite a bit of difficulty finding enough feed. And I just want to give you some sense of some numbers behind that so you have an idea of what we're working with. This table demonstrates the last 2 years worth of production in hay stocks. In 2009 we had in the state of Georgia, and I apologize for Florida, we don't have the Florida data here, but the numbers and the trends are basically the same. In 2009 we had 238,000 tons. Going into 1st of May of 2010, or excuse me, 29. Then 2010 we had dropped down to 210 tons in the state, and now we're down, going into the 1st of May this year, down to 188. So we're decreasing pretty substantially the amount of hay that we have on hand. This also reflects the less production that's going on. Actually, in this particular year, what we've had is less than 12% decrease in hay acreage. So what we're observing is the supply is getting tighter and tighter, and the availability of quality hay is getting tighter and tighter as some of those acres have gone into row crops or just completely been taken out of production because of the expense. So we've got to make that hay go as far as we can and try to make sure whatever forage that we produce, we get as much of that into the mouth of the animal that we can. So what I thought I would do is go over some of the statistics or what we found in the literature of different losses associated with making hay or making baleage. Now obviously there's a big difference between storing that hay outside without any cover on the ground versus under roof. And you can see how the harvest losses are not different here, but the storage losses are dramatically different. On the ground without any cover, the range in the research shows anywhere from 5 to 50% stored. And the problem with that is in the southeast, that's where that 50 number came from. Where we have a lot of humidity, a lot of moisture in the winter months, we get a lot of deterioration, especially in smaller bales. As a general rule, we average somewhere around 20 in just in storage losses alone stored outside. Of course, under roof, it's going to be much less than that. It's going to be, as a general rule, somewhere around 5% is all we're going to lose, and that'll be in the first year. Actually, long-term studies have shown that hay does not deteriorate much after that first year, so your dry matter losses will be relatively low after that first year. So if you need to store some hay over the long term, or if you are looking for some hay right now and you find some that has been stored long term under cover, it's probably still pretty good hay. Then we get down to feeding losses, and this is where we're going to spend most of our time today, is talking about feeding losses. Depending on the feeding method, you can have anywhere from 3.5% up to 25%, and that's in addition to the weather losses, the storage losses that we have in the field. So if you total all those up in terms of a cumulative loss, we're talking anywhere from 25 to over 70% loss in those systems. Pretty conservatively, the average of that is about 39 to 40%. In many years, it's going to be much higher than that overall. The baleage systems actually come in and are very helpful from the standpoint of minimizing these losses. You can see that they cut down the losses both at the harvest stage and especially at the storage phase and in the feeding phases as well. Now, interestingly enough, this says up to 40% storage losses. I included all of the data that was in the literature, and this included some of the very early work with bale silage systems. And with the stretch wrap systems that we have this day and age, that averages is much, much lower. Storage losses are usually less than 10%. We would say roughly an average of about 8% overall. The feeding losses are exceptionally low as well with that, especially if we have a hay ring or some kind of feeder that we're using to feed that with. Because they really do find that palatable and they clean it up very well. So the total dry matter losses there are going to be less than 25% as a general rule, and typically it's going to be somewhere in that 10 to 12% range for the whole year. So let's look at this in terms of a value of the storage system. So what I have here is three different types of hay storage and the approximate loss using those average percentages that I talked about earlier for each of those different ones for the entire system. So 39% for hay, no cover on the ground, and that's an overall average. 23% under roof, or 12% for baleage. Again, these are all based on a lit review. These numbers you could round them up to 10, 20, and almost 40, as giving you a good idea of what's going to happen. What I did is give you a range of cost of production here, and to determine what kind of value this hay has and what that valued loss is. So for example, if we're storing hay outside on the ground, and the hay is actually valued at $120 a ton, then we're actually losing $46.80 for every ton of hay that we're storing. Okay, so putting some dollars and cents to this, it actually makes it pretty apparent we're losing a lot of money by storing that hay outside. So most everybody here hopefully are going to be storing that hay under roof. We drop that down to about $27.60. Now with baleage, because the losses are so much lower, the total losses for the whole system are going to be somewhere around $14.40. So if you can take this number and add to it the cost of production of making the baleage in addition to that, and then this is the margin which you have to work with. Okay? Or in the case of storing it outside, you have this amount of margin between these two to be able to work with. So if you can do it for cheaper than that, you're going to be money ahead to do it the baleage route. As a general rule, if you've got fairly good size to your operation, the baleage is going to be a far superior option, particularly for our winter annual species, rye, ryegrass, triticale, wheat and oats, and those sorts of things that we may be trying to conserve that forage. Baleage is a really good option for that. Even for Tipton 85 and our Bermuda grasses, it works quite well, and also for the summer annuals that we saw earlier today, the pearl millets, the sorghum Sudans, and the BMR varieties of those. This is a really great system to work with there. Okay, so this is getting right down to brass tacks in terms of how much feeding losses we do see. And this is a summary of research. There's about 3 articles that are 3 different really good research articles that have looked at this, and I'm going to kind of give you the highlights of it, give you the ranges here. I'm going to start at the bottom and work my way up. Probably the most inefficient of the feeding type systems. Now this is beyond just letting the bale sit out there and the animals have at it. But with a bale feeding system here, like a bale cradle, you're still getting about 15 to 20% feeding losses. Okay, this is just feeding losses. This is not the weathered losses as well. Okay, this is just feeding losses. Now with the trailer types, and I know many folks have trailer type feeders, very convenient, very efficient, and I certainly understand that's probably the best fit for many of our larger operators. But you got to realize you're losing 10 to 13% according to the research. And many of these, of course, it could be much higher than that. This was all of these were done over a short duration, usually within less than about 3 days of feeding. Now, unrolled and put on fed directly on the ground. What kind of losses do we see there? Well, if the animals clean it up very fast, and in just a matter of hours, those losses actually can be quite low. Okay? But typically what happens is that when we unroll that bale, we're feeding that usually for a relatively small number of animals over a longer period of time. And as a result, typically what we see is if it's left out there for a full day, it'll be about 12 to 15%. If it's left out there longer than that, the longest study that I saw was 7 days, and the losses there were up to 45%. Okay? So we definitely can lose a lot by unrolling it and putting it right directly on the ground. The next one is one that we're all pretty familiar with, is the steel rings, and now more commonly you see a few more of these plastic or black PVC type of feeders. I put a little question mark here with the black plastic ones. We haven't seen any good data on those yet, but we assume that they'll be fairly similar to the steel rings. Generally what we see there in a 3-day window, a loss or waste of 4 to 7%. Okay? So you may say that I see more loss than that in my operation. Well, again, this is just the feeding losses and not refusal because of weather losses. So weather losses would be in addition to this, but still yet, we're cutting down on that waste pretty significantly. Now, some of you may have seen some of these cone ring feeders out there. Instead of a normal ring feeder that the bale either sits directly on the ground or on a pallet or something like that, these cone feeders actually have a cone-shaped bar arrangement inside of the ring where that bale sets down inside that cone and it keeps it up off the bale a little bit, or excuse me, off the ground a little bit. So as long as that bale is not in direct contact with the soil, it prevents it from wicking up moisture, and it also helps with the cleanup. Whatever has fallen down through that cone, it helps the animals clean that up. And so what the research has shown with this, and this is relatively new, there's only one study that I'm aware of where they've looked at this, but the results there are somewhere between 2 and 5% waste. So we can dramatically reduce our waste. Now, you know, if we're talking the difference between 10 and 5%, 5% doesn't sound like a whole lot, but when we start talking about $120, $130, or a whole lot more than that a ton of dry matter, then we're talking about a pretty significant amount of money. Now, of course, this is unrolled on the ground in terms of soil, right out in the pasture or something like that. If we're feeding and we're grinding it off and we're feeding it right onto a concrete slab, those losses can be relatively minor if you've got good management and good control of your animals and your staff to make sure that the staff know how to feed that hay to minimize loss.